Hello friends, so in this video I'm going to talk about James chapter 5 verses 7 through 10, which is the epistle reading from the lectionary for the third week of Advent in year A. So a little bit of context before we get into the passage itself. I just wanted to include some of the preceding context here in the verses that preceding this, and notice that the passage that we're talking about this week directly follows on this warning to the wealthy. So look at some of this really strong language that's used here in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 5. Pay attention, you wealthy people. Weep and mourn over the miseries coming upon you. Listen, hear the cries of the wages of your field hands. These are the wages you stole from those who harvested your fields. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of heavenly forces. You have lived a self-satisfying life on this earth, a life of luxury. You have stuffed your hearts in preparation for the day of slaughter, which is such an interesting image, right? Like, I think this imagery here of stuffing your hearts is sort of playing on the imagery of like hardness of heart that we often hear in the scripture. But there's this idea that like the wealthy people's wealth and luxury is what's done the hardening, right? It's like they've stuffed themselves with good things, and the sort of fat around the heart, right, has insulated it and made them hard-hearted, right? I think that's actually the image there is like uh, the sort of layer of fat around the heart that is making it insensitive, right? That's the hardness of heart. But then there's like a double meaning, like you've stuffed your hearts in preparation for the day of slaughter, like you would stuff an animal, right? You would feed an animal to be slaughtered. So, really, a fascinating, poignant, and quite frankly, like insulting, right, in a way, image here of like wealth causing those who have it to be both hard-hearted and prepared for slaughter. I mean, it's a strong image here, right? Strong judgment. Verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous one who doesn't oppose you. So these are the verses that lead up to our verses for the lectionary reading this week. This warning, like really severe warning to the wealthy. And I mean, I don't think it just so happens that this follows on these verses. I do think they're connected in a way, right? I mean, after all, we see right here, therefore, or if we go to the passage over here, right? Therefore, so like what's being said in verses 7 through 10 and follow immediately on that warning, right? So it's like because of the warning to the wealthy that we've just issued, now we're going to say what we're about to say. And the thing is, notice the change in the way people are being addressed, right? That in verse 1 of chapter 5, it's pay attention, you wealthy people. And then down here, when we get to verse 7, it's therefore brothers and sisters, right? So there's actually an implication here that the wealthy people are not the brothers and sisters, right? The brothers and sisters are going to be um, are being addressed as a group separate from the wealthy people. You actually see this in some of the prophets as well, which this passage references later, right? I think it's Micah, if I remember correctly, will say things like addresses the rulers and the wealthy and those in power, and says things like, "You flay the skin off of my people," right? So there's this sort of implied separation of those who are wealthy and in power leading the people astray and punishing the people. But it's God just saying through the prophet, you flay the skin off of my people, you take advantage of my people, which then has the implication that even though these are the rulers and leaders and priests of Israel and Judah that are being talked about, you would think those would be part of the my people, but there's an implied separation there, right? So it's interesting the language of address that's used in this passage. I'm not attempting to make a statement here about wealth automatically excluding people from Christian community or something like that, but I think it's noteworthy that James is making this distinction when he's talking to his brothers and sisters. that doesn't seem to include the wealthy. That seems to be a separate group of people, right? And I think that actually really matters for what we're thinking about here, um, with the meaning of this passage, right? So he says, therefore, brothers and sisters, in verse 7, getting into the passage for this week, you must be patient as you wait for the coming of the Lord. Now, I just want to note here, patience is clearly the message of this passage, right? And I've alluded to that in a number of ways right here by highlighting all the ways that it mentions patience. Therefore, brothers and sisters, you must be patient as you wait for the coming of the Lord. Consider the farmer who waits patiently for the coming of rain in the fall and spring, looking forward to the precious fruit of the earth. You also must wait patiently, strengthening your resolve because of the coming of the Lord. Um, and then let's see. I thought there were four. Yeah, in verse 10, uh, take the prophets who've spoken in the Lord as an example of patient resolve and steadfastness. So the one thing we absolutely shouldn't miss here is that these verses are clearly an admonition to patience. But I think we should note too that the admonition to patience is connected to the warning of the previous verses, right? The warning of the previous verses is that these wealthy people who are James is addressing are causing injustice and harm and oppression. And so the admonition to the brothers and sisters to be patient is in response to that, right? So it's not just a sort of general admonition to patience, but it's an admonition to patience concerning the injustices of the world, I think. That, yes, these wealthy individuals are carrying out this oppression and harm, but what James is calling the brothers and sisters to is to continue to be patient in spite of the harm, in the midst of the harm that is being inflicted in these oppressive practices, right? And I think maybe there's even, I want to say more about the patience in just a second, but um, I think maybe there's even like a little bit of a wordplay going on here, and you can see what I have right here. That in well, it's verses 8 and 9, right? It says, "You also must wait patiently." And the CEB, the Common English Bible, is what I have up here. It says, "Strengthening your resolve." In Greek, it's the word sterexite, um, which is something like strengthen, which is what you have here. Although this makes it sound like it's a participle, it's actually a command. And the Greek reads quite literally like strengthen your hearts, which means essentially the same thing as strengthen your resolve. Strengthen your hearts because the parousia, which is a word that's used throughout the New Testament for the appearance or coming of the Lord. Paul uses it all the time. I think the Gospels use it occasionally. James uses it here. Strengthen your hearts because the parousia of the coming or the appearing of the Lord is near. And then in verse 9, this says, don't complain. Uh, do not stenedzate, do not grumble, brothers and sisters, against one another, is the way I would translate the Greek. So I just think maybe there's a little bit of a wordplay here because it's saying essentially, sterixate, don't stenadzate, right? And so you can hear how those sound similar. Of course, in Greek, the endings of the words are similar because they're second person plural commands. So that similarity is somewhat incidental, but you do have the ste sound at the beginning of each one to make them similar as well. And so maybe a little bit of wordplay saying, sterexate, don't stenadzate, strengthen your hearts, with resolve. Don't grumble. In any case, like I said, I think the main idea here is this admonition to patience in the midst of injustice. And so I think if I was preaching or teaching from this passage, this is the point that I would want to highlight most, that James is encouraging us to wait patiently for God to correct the injustices of the world. But I would add to that, or I mean, I don't think it's an addition. I think it's a extrapolation of the sort of examples, the illustration that James gives, that that we wait patiently, even as we sow seeds of justice like the farmer and speak words of justice like the prophets. In other words, the thing that I want to emphasize, which is really an important theme in the season of Advent, is that yes, we are encouraged to wait patiently, and that is definitely the main theme of this passage and one of the main themes of the season of Advent, right? But as always, that Christian waiting, that Christian hope, it's an expectant, anticipatory patience, right? It is not a passive patience. And I think that's really drawn out by the illustrations that James uses because he points you to the farmer, right? He says, consider the farmer who waits patiently for the coming of rain in the fall and spring. And so you might say, oh, okay, so the farmer's waiting. That makes it sound like he's not doing anything. But of course, we know that's not true of farmers, right? Farmers actually work very hard. They have to plant the seed, they have to till the soil. When the rain does come, they have to continue to care for the crop. And of course, eventually they have to harvest it, right? So, I mean, James is emphasizing that the farmer has to wait patiently, right? He can't harvest the crop too early or he would ruin it. And I think that's the main theme that is coming through here is if you try to reap a harvest of justice too quickly, too early, sort of try to force the situation in a sense, then there's a sense in which there's a risk of ruining the harvest, right? But the patient waiting is not a just passive sitting around and doing nothing, right? The farmer had to plant the seed and then he waits for the rain, right? And I think that's a really sort of appropriate image for Christian hope and for Christian patience. That it is not just a sitting around waiting for God to do everything. It is we plant the seed and then we wait for God to provide the rain that causes that seed to grow. And I have to bring in here one of my favorite lines from the play Hamilton. And any of you who have heard me preach have heard me use this line probably on a number of occasions. But I just think it's a pretty profound line, right? Where Hamilton is reflecting on his legacy and the kind of legacy that he's going to leave behind. And in the midst of that reflection, he has this quote. He says, "What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see," right? And I think that's kind of a profound thing for us to reflect on because so often in life, like especially in life and modern life in the United States, we are conditioned to seeing results immediately, right? You go through a fast food drive-through and you have food immediately. You Google something on your phone, you have results immediately. You order something on Amazon, it comes to your door in just a couple of days, right? Like we are just conditioned to having the whole world at our fingertips all the time, and we get extremely impatient when we have to wait on anything because most of the time we don't have to, right? It's so rare. Like we've constructed this world in which we can have things from the other side of the world in a matter of a day or two, right? So, like, I think in many ways we are people who are not conditioned to think about the arc of history beyond our own lifetimes, right? Or we tend to think of spiritual growth in terms of days and weeks when really we should think of it in terms of years and decades, right? Um, and I think like this quote from Hamilton helps us think about that, right? The whole idea of I'm going to plant a seed that I may never see grow, right? That it's a garden that someone else will till and care for and reap the benefits of. I'm just planting the seed. And I think that's true a lot of times in life, especially with regard to matters of justice, that often we may only sow the seeds of a movement of justice in our lifetimes, and it will often be the next generation or a couple generations later that will really benefit from the seed that we've sown, and we may never see the outcome of that. And I think it's also very true of the biblical story. I mean, you see this with biblical characters over and over and over again, right? I mean, I think especially of Abraham and Sarah, right? God promises Abraham that he's going to be a father of many nations. When he dies, he has one child, right? He has, well, one child with Sarah, right? He also has Ishmael, but he has just Isaac as the child of promise. So the promise is you're going to be a father of many nations, and he has one child with Sarah, right? So within Abraham's lifetime, it may very well look like that promise goes unfulfilled. But of course, if you follow the rest of the biblical narrative, we know that it is very much fulfilled, right? Or you think about Moses, right? That God calls Moses to deliver people from Egypt, and of course he does get to see that, but Moses never enters the promised land, right? He never gets to go. He's part of the the generation that passes away in the wilderness and never gets to enter the promised land. He only sees it from a distance. And of course, this passage in James says, uh, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of patient resolve and steadfastness, right? So people like Amos and Micah and Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah, right? All of these prophets who spoke the word of the Lord, how many of them saw their message come to fruition, right? Not very many of them, right? Most of the time, um, they're talking about something that extends beyond their lifetime, right? I mean, they may be warning about things that are about to happen in their lifetime, but some of the sort of longer term promises of the restoration of Israel and things like that don't happen until after their lifetime for many of them, right? So the prophets are also this example of people who sow this seed, right? They speak words of justice. They call Israel and Judah back to God's law, God's teaching about justice. But that doesn't mean that they see it fulfilled in their lifetime, right? I mean, I think of the prophet Habakkuk as one of my favorite examples. Habakkuk complains to God about the injustice in Judah and says, God, what are you going to do about this? And then he says, I'm going to bring the Babylonians to destroy everything. And Habakkuk's like, wait, that's not quite the answer I was looking for, right? Um, so there's a sense in which I don't know if Habakkuk ever sees justice restored in Judah in the way that he was expecting, but nonetheless, he spoke the message faithfully. And I think that's a good picture of what this passage in James is calling us to. Yes, we live in a world of injustice and oppression where people are taken advantage of, and there's this sort of balancing act, I guess, so to speak, a needle to try to thread, so to speak, right? That on the one hand, James clearly calls us to wait patiently, that it seems from James' mindset there are certain things that only God will ultimately correct, and yet that call to patience is not a call to do nothing, right? It is still a call to plant the seed, to speak the words of justice, but then having done so, to endure patiently, right? We might almost think of this call to patience as not a passive thing, but as a call to endurance, to persevere, right? To have a view of the long moral arc of the universe, to allude to Dr. King, right? That we're looking beyond our lifetime as we think about the ways that God is going to act in the world. So I think this message from James is a pertinent one for this third week of Advent as we think about what it means to be a people of hope and patience and endurance as we look forward to Christ's kingdom.